She thought the message would change her life, and it did, just not in the way she imagined. When Amina Benjelloun's phone buzzed with a notification from the medical networking app, she was in the middle of her 14th hour at Casablanca's public hospital. Her scrubs were stained with coffee and antiseptic, her feet ached. Another patient was coding down the hall, alarm screaming, and she had 3 more medication rounds to complete before her shift ended. She almost didn't check the message, almost kept walking. But something made her stop, pull out her phone, and read the words that would lead her, months later, to die alone in the frozen Norwegian wilderness. The message was from Dr. Henrik Johansson. His profile photo showed a blond man in his early 40s, handsome in an understated Nordic way, standing in front of what looked like mountains. His credentials were impressive. Emergency medicine specialist, Oslo University medical degree, published researcher. The message itself was professional, respectful. He'd read her post about pediatric triage protocols in under-resourced hospitals and wanted to hear more about her approach. "Your perspective is exactly what we need more of in international medical discourse," he wrote. No flirtation, no inappropriate comments, just one medical professional reaching out to another. Amina responded during her break, sitting in the staff room with lukewarm tea and stale bread. She explained her methods, the challenges of working in a system where supplies ran short and patient loads ran high. Henrik replied within an hour. Their conversation continued over the next few days, always professional, always focused on medicine. He asked intelligent questions. He shared research papers. He treated her like a colleague, like someone whose opinion mattered. In a job where she was often invisible, overworked and underpaid, that recognition felt like oxygen. Amina had always been the responsible one. The eldest daughter of 3 children, raised by a widowed mother who worked as a seamstress in the Medina. Her father had died when she was 12, a heart attack that came without warning and left them scrambling to survive. Her mother had pushed her toward nursing. "It's stable," she'd said. "People always need nurses. You'll never be without work." She'd been right, but she never mentioned how exhausting that work would be, how little it paid, how the system would grind you down until you felt more like a machine than a healer. Her apartment was small, a studio in a neighborhood where the call to prayer echoed 5 times a day and the streets smelled like cumin and exhaust. She shared it with her younger sister Fatima, who was studying to be a teacher. Their mother lived 20 minutes away with their brother, still in high school. Amina sent money home every month. What was left barely covered rent and groceries. Her bedroom wall was covered with postcards from places she'd never been: Oslo, Stockholm, Geneva. Cities where nurses earned real salaries, where healthcare systems functioned, where you didn't have to choose between paying rent and buying new shoes. She'd tried emigrating before. Applications to hospitals in France and Belgium had gone unanswered. Her English was good, but her French was better, and still the European healthcare system seemed impenetrable, protected by layers of bureaucracy and preference for EU citizens. She'd almost given up on the idea, almost accepted that this was her life, that she'd work herself to exhaustion in Casablanca until her body gave out, just like her father's had. Then Henrik's messages started shifting from professional to personal. It happened gradually. 3 weeks into their correspondence, he mentioned that he was divorced, that he lived alone in Tromsø, a city in Arctic Norway. He said the winters were brutal, dark for months, but the summers made up for it with endless light. He sent photos. The northern lights dancing green and purple across the sky. Mountains that looked like they'd been carved by gods. His apartment, modern and minimalist, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a fjord. "It's beautiful," he wrote, "but lonely." Amina found herself looking forward to his messages. He asked about her family, her dreams, the patients who stayed with her long after their shifts ended. He told her about his own loneliness, how Norwegian women found him too serious, too consumed by his work. "I think I intimidate them," he wrote. "I don't mean to. I just care deeply about what I do." She understood that. She cared deeply too, maybe too deeply for her own good. One night, after a particularly difficult shift where a child had died despite everything she'd done to save him, Amina sat in her apartment and cried. She messaged Henrik without thinking, just needing someone to understand. He video called her immediately. His face filled her screen, concerned and kind. "Tell me what happened," he said. She did. She told him everything, the fear in the mother's eyes, the helplessness she felt, the rage at a system that let children die for lack of basic equipment. Henrik listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said something that stayed with her. "You're too good for a system that doesn't value you." After that, they video called often. Henrik showed her around his apartment, his view of the midnight sun in summer, the way light reflected off snow in winter. He was exactly as his photos suggested. Tall, athletic, with the kind of understated handsomeness that came from good genes and an active lifestyle. His accent was thick but charming. He cooked dinner while they talked, explaining Norwegian dishes, asking about Moroccan food. He seemed genuinely interested in her culture, asking respectful questions about Islam, about Ramadan, about her family's traditions. He never pushed boundaries, never made her uncomfortable. 4 months into their connection, Henrik sent her a package. Inside was a silver necklace with a small pendant shaped like a snowflake. "I saw this and thought of you," his note said, delicate but stronger than it looks. Amina's hands trembled as she put it on. Her sister Fatima raised an eyebrow. "Who sends expensive jewelry to someone they've never met?" she asked. Amina defended him. "He's just kind. He has no one else to spoil." But she felt the shift happening, the way their friendship was becoming something else, something neither of them had named yet. That's when Henrik made his proposal. Not marriage, not yet, though he hinted that might come later. Something more practical. His hospital in Tromsø was desperately hiring foreign nurses through a special immigration program. The pay was 45,000 euros annually, housing assistance provided, full benefits, Norwegian language classes, a pathway to permanent residency. "I would never ask you to come just for me," he said carefully during their video call. "This is about your career, your future. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't hope we could explore what this is between us once you're here." He sent documents. A job offer letter from Tromsø University Hospital, official and stamp date visa application forms. A contract for temporary housing. Everything looked legitimate, professional, real. Amina researched obsessively. The hospital existed. It was one of the largest in northern Norway. Other foreign nurses had been hired there. The immigration program was real. She even called the hospital directly, asked about Dr. Henrik Johansson. "Yes, he works here," the receptionist confirmed in accented English. "Emergency department. Very good doctor." Her mother was cautious when Amina told her. They sat in the small living room where Amina had grown up, drinking mint tea, her mother's weathered hands wrapped around the glass. "You barely know this man," she said. "What if he's not what he seems?" Amina showed her everything. The documents, the hospital website, the research she'd done. "This is a real opportunity, Mama. I could send you 500 euros a month and still live better than I do now. Fatima could finish university without working nights. Ahmed could focus on his studies." Her best friend Salma was more direct. "Why does a successful Norwegian doctor need to find a woman on the internet?" she asked. They were having coffee at their favorite cafe in the Medina, watching tourists haggle over leather bags. "Can't he find someone local?" Amina bristled. "Maybe he wants someone who understands what it's like to struggle. Maybe he's tired of privileged women who've never worked a real day in their lives." Salma grabbed her hand. "I'm not trying to hurt you. I just want you to be careful. Promise me you'll trust your instincts. If anything feels wrong, you'll leave immediately." Amina promised, though part of her resented the implication that she couldn't take care of herself. She was 29 years old. She'd survived nursing school, years of brutal hospital shifts, supporting her family on poverty wages. She wasn't naive. She'd done her research. Everything checked out. Henrik had never pressured her, never made demands, never even asked for anything inappropriate. He respected her faith, her boundaries, her independence. If anything, his patience proved his sincerity. The plane ticket arrived 2 weeks before departure. Business class on Royal Air Moroccan, from Casablanca to Oslo, connecting to Tromsø. Amina had never flown business class in her life. She screenshotted the confirmation and sent it to her mother with 3 heart emojis. Her mother called immediately, voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, Habibti. You've worked so hard for this." They talked for an hour about what Amina should pack, how she should behave, whether she needed new luggage. Her mother tried to give her money for winter clothes, but Amina refused. "Save it for Ahmed's school fees." Henrik said the hospital provides cold weather gear for new employees. The days before departure moved in a strange blur. Amina gave notice at the hospital. Her supervisor seemed unsurprised, almost relieved. "Good for you," she said without looking up from paperwork. "God knows we can't pay you what you're worth." She said goodbye to patients who'd become familiar faces, children she'd watched grow up through repeated visits, elderly people who knew her by name. Some cried. One gave her a small Hamsa hand for protection. "Keep this with you," the old woman said. "Norway is very far from home." Salma threw her a goodbye dinner at a restaurant overlooking the ocean. A handful of nursing school friends came. People who'd scattered across Morocco chasing the same impossible dream of making nursing a sustainable career. They toasted to Amina's success, to her courage, to the beginning of everything. "Don't forget us when you're rich in Norwegian," one joked. Everyone laughed, but Amina saw the envy beneath the humor. They all wanted out. She was just the first one brave enough to actually leave. Her last night in Casablanca, Amina couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to Fatima breathe in the darkness, thinking about everything she was leaving behind. Her mother, her siblings, the city she'd never lived outside of, the language she spoke without thinking, the call to prayer that structured her days, the smell of orange blossoms in spring. She thought about Henrik, about the life waiting for her in a place where winter lasted half the year and the sun disappeared for months. Part of her was terrified, but the larger part, the part that had spent years dreaming of escape, was electric with hope. Salma drove her to the airport in the morning. They didn't talk much. There wasn't much left to say. At the departure gate, Salma hugged her so hard it hurt. "Call me the second you land," she said. "And if anything at all feels wrong, you get on a plane and come home. I'll buy the ticket myself if I have to." Amina promised, though she felt irritated by her friend's worry. Nothing was going to be wrong. This was the opportunity she'd been working toward her entire life. She texted Henrik from the gate, "Boarding now. I still can't believe this is real." His response came immediately. "Believe it. I'm already at the airport in Tromsø. Everything is ready. Your new life starts today." She smiled at her phone, feeling her heart race with equal parts terror and exhilaration. Around her, other passengers chatted in Arabic and French, families heading to Europe for visits, businessmen commuting. She was the only one traveling alone, the only one whose entire life was packed into 2 suitcases. The plane lifted off over Casablanca, the city spreading out beneath her in a maze of white buildings and terracotta roofs. Amina pressed her face to the window and watched Morocco shrink and disappear beneath the clouds. She touched the snowflake necklace at her throat, the gift from a man she'd never met in person but who felt, somehow, like the answer to every prayer she'd never dared to say out loud. She didn't know that the necklace was a collar, that the job was a lie, that the man waiting for her in Tromsø had done this before, perfected his method, turned hope into a trap that only closed once you were too far from home to escape. The flight attendant brought champagne. Amina accepted it, took a sip, felt the bubbles dance on her tongue. She was flying toward a future she'd imagined 1,000 times. But imagination and reality were about to collide in the worst possible way. And by the time she understood the difference, she'd be locked in a cabin in the Arctic darkness, with nowhere to run except into the cold that would eventually kill her. The cold was the first thing that hit her. Not the temperature inside Oslo's airport, which was warm and modern and filled with the sound of rolling suitcases and announcement chimes, but the cold she saw through the windows as her connecting flight descended into Tromsø, endless white, mountains that looked like they'd been carved from ice, a darkness that seemed wrong for mid-afternoon, the sun barely visible on the horizon before giving up entirely. Amina pressed her face to the window and felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't the Norway of Henrik's photos, beautiful and bathed in golden light. This was something else, something vast and indifferent and absolutely unforgiving. Henrik was waiting at arrivals, holding a bouquet of white roses. He looked exactly like his photos, but somehow different in 3 dimensions. Older, harder around the edges, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. He kissed her on both cheeks, European style, and took her suitcases. "How was the flight?" he asked. His English was perfect, but his voice lacked the warmth she remembered from their video calls. Amina told herself it was nerves, that she was exhausted from 15 hours of travel, that of course things felt strange. "I'm just tired," she said. He nodded and led her to the parking lot. The drive from the airport should have been her first warning. They headed away from Tromsø's city lights, away from the buildings and streetlights, into increasingly empty territory. Snow-covered forests pressed in on both sides of the narrow road. No houses, no cars, just darkness and trees, and the occasional reflective marker showing the road's edge. Amina tried to make conversation. "When do I start at the hospital?" "I should probably go there tomorrow to meet everyone, get oriented." Henrik's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "We'll talk about all that once you're settled," he said. "You must be exhausted. Let's just get you home." But home wasn't the modern apartment from his video calls. After 45 minutes of driving, they turned onto an unmarked road that had barely been plowed. The car skidded slightly on ice. Trees closed in overhead, branches heavy with snow creating a tunnel effect. Finally, they arrived at a cabin, small and isolated, surrounded by forest with no other buildings visible in any direction. Amina felt her stomach drop. "This isn't what you showed me," she said carefully. Henrik parked and turned off the engine. "The apartment had a pipe burst last week. Water damage. It's uninhabitable. This is my family's cabin. You'll stay here temporarily while I sort out new housing." The cabin was rustic in a way that might have been charming under different circumstances. Wood-burning stove, small kitchen, thick curtains, one bedroom. But there was no charm in Amina's chest, only growing unease. Henrik brought in her suitcases and gave her a quick tour. He was trying to be warm, attentive, making jokes about Norwegian winter and promising to teach her how to use the stove, but something was off. The way he stood between her and the door, the way his eyes tracked her movements, the way he'd already started criticizing small things, her accent when she spoke English, the impractical shoes she'd worn for travel. That first night, Henrik cooked dinner. "Reindeer stew," he said, "a northern delicacy." Amina couldn't eat. Her appetite had disappeared somewhere over the Atlantic. She picked at the food while Henrik talked about his day at the hospital, about the cases he'd seen, about how glad he was that she was finally here. "You have no idea how long I've been planning this," he said. The words should have been romantic. Instead, they felt like a threat. After dinner, he showed her the bedroom. "You take it," he said. "I'll sleep on the couch. I want you to be comfortable." She thanked him, locked the door, and sat on the bed fully clothed for an hour before she could breathe normally again. She tried to call her mother, but there was no cell service. The phone showed no bars, no network, nothing. Panic rose in her throat. Henrik knocked gently. "Everything okay?" She opened the door. "There's no phone service." He nodded like this was completely normal. "We're pretty remote here. Service is spotty this far out. But there's Wi-Fi. You can use WhatsApp or video calls." He gave her the password. She messaged her mother immediately. "Arrived safely. Everything is beautiful. We'll call properly tomorrow." Her mother responded with heart emojis and prayers. Amina fell asleep in her clothes, too afraid to undress, too exhausted to stay awake. Morning brought complete darkness. Amina woke disoriented, checked her phone. 11 in the morning, but pitch black outside. She stumbled out of the bedroom to find Henrik making coffee. "What's wrong with the sun?" she asked. He laughed. "Polar night. The sun doesn't rise this time of year. You're in the Arctic now. It takes some getting used to." He made her breakfast, explained how the darkness worked, how in summer they'd have midnight sun to compensate. But all Amina could think was that she'd flown into permanent night, into a place where day and night had lost all meaning. She asked about the hospital, about starting work, meeting her new colleagues, getting oriented. Henrik's expression shifted subtly. "There's been a complication with your paperwork," he said. "The hospital needs additional documentation. Your Moroccan credentials need extra verification from the Ministry of Health. It might take a few weeks." Amina's blood went cold. "You said everything was arranged. You said I could start immediately." He poured himself more coffee. "These things take time. Bureaucracy, you understand. But you're here legally as my guest. We have time to sort everything out." Days blurred together in the darkness. Henrik left each morning for work, or so he said. He'd lock the cabin from the outside. "For your safety," he explained. "Bears sometimes come around, and you don't know how to handle the firearms." But Amina knew what a locked door meant. She was a prisoner. She searched the cabin for her passport, for her phone charger, for anything that might help her. Her passport was gone. Henrik had taken it while she slept that first night. When she confronted him, his face went cold. "It's required for visa processing. You'll get it back once everything is approved." But there was no visa processing. There was no job. There was only this cabin and this man, and the darkness pressing in from all sides. Henrik started changing. The mask he'd worn for months through messages and video calls began to slip. He criticized everything about her. Her cooking wasn't right. Her cleaning wasn't thorough enough. Her Arabic accent when speaking English grated on him. He made comments about how lucky she was, how he'd saved her from poverty, how she should be grateful. When she pushed back, when she demanded to see the job offer letter, to call the hospital herself, he laughed. "You think they're just waiting for you? You think one Moroccan nurse matters to them?" His contempt was naked now, ugly and casual. 2 weeks into her captivity, Amina managed to get partial cell service by climbing to the highest point near the cabin. Her hands shook as she called Salma. Her friend answered on the first ring, voice frantic. "Where have you been? Your mother has been calling the embassy, filing reports. No one knows where you are." Amina's voice broke. "The job doesn't exist. He lied about everything. He has my passport, I don't even know exactly where I am. Salma was crying now too. You need to go to the police. Right now. Leave and go to the police. But how? Amina had no car, no money, no idea which direction led to civilization. And Henrik would be home soon. That night, she confronted him with everything. The embassy's confirmation that there was no visa application, the lies about the job, the locked doors and stolen passport. Henrik had been drinking, scotch from a bottle he kept in the kitchen. When she finished talking, he looked at her with something like pity. I never promised you a job, he said quietly. I promised you a better life. And this is better. You have food, shelter, warmth. Do you know what you'd have in Morocco? Nothing. At least here you're taken care of. She called him a liar, a kidnapper. He just smiled. Where will you go? You're illegal. No visa, no passport, no money. If you go to police, they'll deport you. At least here, I take care of you. The truth crystallized in that moment. Henrik had done this before. The careful selection of someone from a poor country, someone ambitious and desperate. The months of grooming, building trust, creating dependency. The false documents and promises. The isolated location where screaming meant nothing because no one could hear. He perfected this. And Amina was just his latest acquisition, another beautiful thing to keep in his collection. She asked about other women. He didn't deny it. You're special, though, he said. The others didn't appreciate what I offered. But you will. In time, you'll understand. You'll be grateful. The cabin became her entire world. 20 hours of darkness every day. Henrik locking her in when he left, taking her phone, disconnecting the Wi-Fi so she couldn't call for help. He brought groceries, cooked meals, tried to maintain the pretense of domesticity. But there was no hiding what this was anymore. He treated her like a pet, sometimes kind, sometimes cruel, always controlling. He hadn't forced himself on her sexually, not yet, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. He'd touch her shoulder when he passed, let his hand linger too long, make comments about patience, about how she'd come around eventually. Amina pretended to soften. It was a survival strategy, the only one she had left. She stopped fighting him openly, started accepting the situation with apparent resignation. She cooked the meals he wanted, cleaned the way he demanded, spoke softly and didn't argue. She saw relief in his eyes, satisfaction that she was finally submitting. But in her mind, she was planning. She found spare clothes in a closet, thermal layers that might protect her from the cold, an old map of the region in a drawer, showing distances between locations, a flashlight with weak batteries. She studied the landscape during the brief moments of twilight, trying to memorize landmarks, figure out which direction might lead to help. 3 weeks into her imprisonment, Henrik announced he had an overnight shift at the hospital. He'd be gone from evening until the next afternoon. He said it casually, like this was normal, like she hadn't been locked in a cabin for weeks. There's food in the fridge, he said. I'll bring back supplies tomorrow. He kissed her forehead, a gesture that made her skin crawl, and she forced herself to smile. She watched him drive away, waiting until the sound of his car completely disappeared. Then she waited another hour, terrified he'd come back to test her, to see if she'd try to escape. When she finally moved, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the chair she used to break the bedroom window. The glass shattered, sound impossibly loud in the silence. She climbed through carefully, using blankets to protect herself from the remaining shards. The cold hit her like a physical blow, -30°C, maybe worse with wind chill. She'd layered every piece of clothing she could find, but it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Her breath froze in her lungs. Her face went numb within seconds. But she ran anyway, into the forest, following what she hoped was the direction of the main road. The darkness was absolute. Her flashlight beam seemed pathetic against it, a tiny circle of light swallowed by infinite black. Snow came up to her knees in places. She had no idea she was even moving in a straight line. Time lost meaning. She could have been walking for 20 minutes or 2 hours. Her body began shutting down, the cold working its way from her extremities toward her core. She couldn't feel her feet anymore. Her hands had gone from painful to numb to absent. She fell, got up, fell again. The forest was endless, indifferent, silent except for her own harsh breathing and the crunch of snow beneath her boots. Then she saw lights. Green and purple dancing across the sky, beautiful and surreal. The northern lights, the aurora borealis that Henrik had shown her in those early photos when he was still pretending to be someone trustworthy. She stumbled toward them, thinking they were civilization, thinking someone had left lights on, thinking she was saved. But the lights moved and shifted, always just out of reach. She realized with dawning horror that she'd been following them in circles, that they weren't real lights but atmospheric phenomena. that she'd wasted energy and time and body heat chasing something that couldn't save her. Amina collapsed in the snow. She couldn't feel most of her body anymore. The cold had moved past painful into something almost peaceful, a numbness that felt like sleep. She thought about her mother receiving the news that her daughter had died in Norway. She thought about Salma's warning to trust her instincts, and how she'd ignored every red flag because she wanted so badly to believe in the dream Henrik offered. She thought about all the other women he'd done this to, and the ones who might come after. She hoped someone would find her body. She hoped they'd know this wasn't an accident, wasn't a hiking trip gone wrong. She hoped Henrik would pay for what he'd done. Her last conscious thought was a prayer, not for herself anymore, that was past hoping, but for her mother, for Salma, for her siblings, that they'd understand she'd tried, that she'd fought until her body gave out, that she'd refused to submit even if it meant dying in the snow. And there was something else too, a final desperate hope that whoever found her would ask the right questions, that her death wouldn't be written off as a tragic accident, that someone would care enough to dig deeper and find the truth buried under Henrik's lies. The snow began to cover her, soft and cold and final, and the Arctic night, indifferent and eternal, swallowed her whole. In the distance, lights that might have been the aurora, or might have been hallucination, danced and flickered. The forest was silent except for wind through the pines, and Amina Benjelloun, 29 years old, nurse from Casablanca, dreamer of better lives, lay freezing in the darkness while the man who'd killed her slept peacefully in a hospital break room, confident that when he returned to his cabin tomorrow, she'd still be there, broken and compliant and high. But she wasn't there anymore. She was 2 kilometers away, buried in snow, slowly becoming part of the landscape. And that absence, that empty cabin and broken window, would be the beginning of Henrik's end. Because predators make mistakes. They get comfortable. They believe their own lies about control and possession. And sometimes, the women they try to erase become impossible to ignore precisely because they refuse to disappear quietly. Amina had run into the cold knowing she might die, but she'd also run knowing that her body, if found, would tell a story Henrik couldn't control, and in the end, that story would matter more than anything he'd ever tried to make her believe about gratitude and submission and knowing her place. The Arctic held her now, but it wouldn't keep her secrets. And Henrik Johansson, who thought he'd perfected the art of making women vanish, was about to learn that some disappearances demand answers, that some bodies, even frozen and silent, speak louder than any living voice. The search and rescue team found her on a Thursday. They'd been looking for a German tourist who'd gotten separated from a hiking group when one of the volunteers saw something that didn't belong, a patch of color against the endless white, fabric, torn and frozen. They approached carefully, thinking it might be equipment left behind, a discarded tent or backpack. Instead, they found a body, a woman, partially buried in snow wearing layers of mismatched clothing, her face preserved by the extreme cold. She looked almost peaceful, like she'd simply laid down to rest. But her hands told a different story. They were clawed, reaching, frozen in the act of trying to pull herself forward. The police were called immediately. This wasn't a hiking accident. The woman wore no proper winter gear, no equipment, nothing that suggested she'd planned to be in the wilderness. Her clothing was wrong, stolen or borrowed, indoor layers that offered no real protection against Arctic conditions. And she was 2 kilometers from the nearest structure, a hunting cabin registered to a family named Johansson. The lead investigator, a woman named Kristen Berg, who'd worked these mountains for 15 years, looked at the body and knew immediately this was something darker than a lost tourist. This was someone who'd run, someone who'd fled into certain death because whatever she was running from was worse. They couldn't identify her at first. No ID, no phone, no wallet. But there were clues. Her skin tone suggested North African or Middle Eastern origin, and one of the shirts she wore had a laundry tag from Tromsø University Hospital. That was the thread they pulled. The hospital confirmed the shirt was issued to staff. They cross-referenced recent hires, visitors, anyone who might have access to staff clothing. That's when Dr. Henrik Johansson's name came up. He worked in emergency medicine. The cabin where the body was found belonged to his family. Police went to question him as a potential witness. Someone who might have seen something, might know who this woman was. Henrik was at his apartment in Tromsø when they knocked. He answered the door in casual clothes, calm and cooperative, showing just the right amount of concern when they explained about the body. "That's terrible," he said. "But I haven't been to the cabin in weeks. I've been working double shifts, sleeping here in town. Is there any way to identify her?" His performance was good, practiced. But Detective Bird noticed small things. The way his eyes moved when they mentioned the hospital laundry tag, The slight pause before he denied knowing anyone from North Africa, the tension in his shoulders that didn't match his casual tone. They asked to see the cabin. Henrik hesitated, just a fraction of a second. "Of course," he said. "I'll need to find the keys. Can we go tomorrow morning?" Berg said yes, but made a note. That night, while Henrik thought he had time to prepare, prosecutors were already obtaining a search warrant, not just for the cabin, but for his apartment, his phone, his computer. Something about his demeanor had set off alarms. And Berg trusted her instincts. She'd seen enough liars to recognize one wearing a concerned citizen's face. Meanwhile, in Casablanca, Amina's mother was losing her mind. Her daughter had been unreachable for 3 weeks. The Moroccan embassy in Norway had filed missing person reports, but with no concrete information, no address, no evidence Amina had even entered the country. The case had stalled. Salma had been calling Norwegian police daily, explaining about the doctor, the job offer, the messages. But without proof, without documentation, it was just another story about a young woman who'd maybe changed her mind, maybe run off with a boyfriend, maybe never intended to stay in touch. The embassy official had been blunt. "Without evidence of foul play, we can't force an investigation." Then the call came. The Norwegian police had found an unidentified female body, possible North African origin, near Tromsø. Could the family provide dental records? Amina's mother collapsed when she received the news. Salma held her on the kitchen floor while she screamed, a sound that neighbors would later say haunted them for months. They sent Amina's dental records from her clinic in Casablanca. 3 days later, the identification was confirmed through forensic odontology. The body found in the snow was Amina Benjelloun. Cause of death, severe hypothermia. Manner of death, still under investigation. Police executed the search warrant on Henrik's apartment at dawn. They found his computer first, and what was on it destroyed any chance he had at innocence. Months of messages with Amina, every promise he'd made, every lie he'd told. The fake job offer documents saved in a folder labeled projects. His search history was damning. How to forge hospital employment letters, Norwegian immigration law regarding visa sponsorship, legal penalties for human trafficking. And then, in the weeks before Amina's death, searches that made the investigators' blood run cold. Arctic survival rates, hypothermia timeline. How long can someone survive in negative 30-degree weather? Missing person investigation procedures. They found more. Financial records showing the plane ticket he'd purchased, emails with a document forging service in Estonia, and most damning, a folder of photographs. Women. All young, all foreign, all beautiful, in that specific way Henrik seemed to prefer. Dark hair, olive skin, elegant features. Some of the photos were casual, screenshots from social media. Others were more intimate, clearly taken without the subject's knowledge. And there was a subfolder labeled with names. Inside were hundreds of photos of women who'd clearly been in the cabin, modeling clothing, posing, looking increasingly uncomfortable as the photo sets progressed. One set was labeled Maria, 2021. Police tracked her down in Manila. She'd been a nurse too, recruited online by Henrik with promises of employment. She'd spent 3 weeks in that cabin before he finally let her leave, driving her to the airport with threats that, if she reported him, he'd have her arrested for immigration fraud. She'd been too terrified and ashamed to tell anyone. She'd returned to the Philippines and tried to forget it ever happened. But she remembered everything. The locked doors, the stolen passport, the way he'd collected her like an object, photographing her, dressing her, keeping her like she was his property. They found 2 other women with similar stories. A Thai nurse in 2019 who'd escaped after 2 months. A Tunisian woman in 2020 who'd stayed only a week before threatening to hurt herself if he didn't let her go. All of them had been too scared or ashamed to report him. All of them had believed his threats about deportation, about legal consequences, about no one believing their word against a respected Norwegian doctor. Henrik had perfected his method over years, carefully selecting victims from countries where women were economically vulnerable, where the promise of European employment was irresistible, where families were desperate enough that their daughters would take risks. The arrest happened at Tromsø University Hospital. Henrik was in the middle of a shift when police arrived, handcuffs ready. His colleagues watched in shock as he was led out through the emergency department. The doctor who'd always been so professional, so reliable, so dedicated to patient care. Later they'd talk about the signs they'd missed, how he'd never dated locally, how he'd sometimes take weeks off to visit family and come back refreshed, how he'd once joked about preferring women who haven't been ruined by feminism. Red flags they'd dismissed as awkward humor from a socially stiff man. The charges were extensive: human trafficking, unlawful imprisonment, document forgery, and negligent homicide. The prosecution argued that while Henrik may not have intended to kill Amina specifically, his actions created the conditions that made her death inevitable. By imprisoning her, by making her so desperate that running into Arctic winter seemed preferable to staying, he'd caused her death as surely as if he'd pushed her into the snow himself. Under Norwegian law, this constituted culpable negligence resulting in death. Henrik's lawyer tried to spin it differently at trial. His client was lonely, desperate for connection. Yes, he'd lied, but he'd never meant harm. Amina had come willingly. She'd accepted gifts, messages, video calls. She could have said no at any point, and her decision to run into the wilderness was her own. My client didn't force her into the cold, his lawyer argued. She chose to leave the safety of a heated cabin. That choice, tragic as it was hers alone. The prosecution destroyed this narrative piece by piece. They showed the fake documents, the pattern of predatory behavior, the testimonies of 3 other women who'd survived similar ordeals. They presented Henrik's search history showing he'd researched hypothermia timelines days before Amina's escape. They brought in a psychologist who specialized in trafficking and coercive control. When you systematically eliminate someone's options, when you take their documents, their money, their means of communication, when you isolate them and make them believe escape will result in arrest or death, you don't get to claim their desperate attempt to flee was a free choice, the expert testified. Amina's mother sat in the courtroom every day, a translator beside her, photographs of her daughter clutched in her hands. She never looked at Henrik. Salma sat next to her, taking notes, recording everything. They'd flown to Oslo on donated funds, strangers from around the world contributing to a crowdfunding campaign to bring Amina's family to Norway for justice. The Moroccan community in Norway packed the gallery, standing when there weren't enough seats, refusing to let this case happen in silence. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Witness after witness described Henrik's calculated cruelty. The woman from Manila broke down on the stand, describing how he'd kept her passport in his pocket, how he'd shown it to her sometimes like it was a toy he might give back if she behaved. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. Amina's body had shown signs of malnutrition. Her hands bore marks from breaking the window. The trajectory of her path through the snow suggested she'd been trying to reach the main road, that she'd been oriented toward help, that this wasn't the suicidal walk into the wilderness but a desperate escape attempt. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. When they returned, the forewoman read the verdict in a steady voice, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Amina's mother sobbed into Salma's shoulder. Henrik showed no emotion, just stared straight ahead as if none of this was really happening to him. The judge was unsparing in her remarks. You used your position as a physician, a position built on trust and care, to hunt vulnerable women. You exploited their hopes and ambitions. When Amina Benjelloun exercised her fundamental human right to escape captivity, your actions had made that escape a death sentence. You are not a victim of circumstance. You are the architect of a tragedy. The sentence was 21 years, the maximum allowed under Norwegian law. It seemed both too much and not nearly enough. 21 years for a life stolen, for a daughter who'd never come home, for dreams turned into a nightmare. Henrik was led away in handcuffs. He'd serve his time in Halden prison, comfortable by global standards, but still prison, still a cage. Other inmates would know what he'd done. Even in Norwegian prisons, men who hurt women occupied the lowest rung. But the case didn't end with Henrik's conviction. Police had found his network, the document forgers in Estonia, similar operations in Romania and Bulgaria, a whole underground economy that helped men traffic women under the guise of employment or romance. Europol launched coordinated raids across 6 countries. Other victims came forward, emboldened by Amina's story. A Filipino woman who'd been kept in Belgium, a Vietnamese woman in Germany. A pattern of predation that stretched across borders, enabled by the internet and economic desperation and the assumption that foreign women's disappearances didn't matter. Amina's body was returned to Casablanca 6 months after her death. Thousands attended her funeral, nursing students and former patients and women who saw themselves in her story, who'd received similar messages from foreign men promising better lives. Her mother established a foundation in her name, funded by donations that poured in from around the world. The Amina Benjelloun Foundation would provide legal support and safe housing for trafficking survivors, and education programs warning young women about romance and employment scams. Salma became the foundation's director, channeling her grief into action. They worked with Moroccan and European authorities to create verification systems for foreign job offers, red flag lists for predatory behavior, emergency resources for women who found themselves trapped abroad. Amina believed in hope, Salma said at the foundation's launch, her voice steady despite tears. She believed in working hard and dreaming big. We will not let her death mean that women should stop hoping or dreaming. We will make sure they can do both safely. In his prison cell, Henrik maintained his delusions. He wrote letters to Amina's mother, trying to explain, to apologize, to rationalize what he'd done. She never opened them. She had them burned, watching the paper curl and blacken, watching his words turn to ash. She didn't need his closure. She'd found her own in the slow work of building something meaningful from her daughter's death, and helping other mothers keep their daughters safe. 3 years after the trial, a journalist asked Amina's mother what she wanted people to remember about her daughter. The translator relayed the question, and the older woman was silent for a long time. She was brave, she finally said. She wanted to heal people. She wanted to make life better for her family. These are good things to want. The world should not punish women for wanting good things, and men like him should not be allowed to turn our dreams into weapons. The memorial for Amina stands on a hill overlooking Casablanca, a bench with her nursing school graduation photo engraved on a plaque. Young women sit there sometimes, students and dreamers, looking out toward the Mediterranean and the Europe beyond. Some still dream of crossing that water, of finding opportunities in distant countries. Because the alternative, accepting that ambition makes you pray, is its own kind of death. The question isn't whether women should dream, it's how we build a world where dreaming doesn't cost your life. The Arctic took Amina Benjelloun's body, but it couldn't take her voice. And that voice, frozen in the snow, recovered by strangers, amplified by those who loved her, became the warning that saved others from walking into the same darkness. Henrik had tried to make her disappear, to add her to his collection of beautiful, silent things, but she'd refused silence even in death. Her body told a story he couldn't control. And every woman who learned from that story, who asked the right questions, who trusted her instincts, who demanded verification before boarding planes to foreign countries, was proof that Amina had won something essential even as she lost everything else. Some lights burn brightest in the coldest places, and Amina's light, terrible and necessary, still burns, in the foundation that bears her name, in the laws that changed because of her case, in the women who lived because she died. Henrik Johansson tried to own her, but in the end, she owned the narrative. And that narrative, painful as it is, matters more than all his lies combined.